The EU and its member state has traditionally considered Ethiopia as a strategic partner due to its population, its military capacities and economic size. These assumptions, however, led the Europeans to turn a blind eye to Ethiopia's internal dynamics. The constitutional, ideological and ethnic compositions of Ethiopia provides a fertile ground for fragmentation to spread and even to escalate into violence, as the brutal war of Tigray demonstrated. As soon as the war broke out in 2020, the EU called for unhindered humanitarian access to the war-affected region, in particular Tigray, suspended financial support for the Ethiopian government, but also imposed sanctions on Eritrea. However, after an initial phase in which intense fighting resulted in an apparent decisive victory of the federal government, the TPLF fought back. TPLF offensive of mid-2021 prompted the EU to adopt a different stances toward the belligerent parties. But even if the EU wanted to re-engage with the federal government, its initial leaning against Addis Ababa had consequences, and this was quite evident during the peace process that was led by the African Union and that broke out a peace deal in November 2022. While Tigrayans always demanded that the United States and the European Union lead the process, the Ethiopian government not only succeeded in keeping the negotiations within the African Union, but also refused to grant the EU or any of its member states an observer status. As soon as the war broke out, the EU rushed into condemning the government in Addis Ababa on the assumption that Abiy was clearly in the wrong. But responsibility for the conflict could not be ascribed to the federal government only. Ethiopia's fragmentation was such that the EU and its member states officials struggled to get a more comprehensive picture. And the reason for that is that the TPLF ruled Ethiopia for more than 20 years, whereby the EU and its member states had developed strong ties with the Tigray leaderships. In addition to this, the EU was caught unprepared by the escalation in Tigray, also because it overestimated its capacity to influence not just Abiy but also the TPLF. While the EU and the United States started to re-engage with national authorities by supporting the African Union peace process and resuming diplomatic relations with Ethiopian authorities, Addis Ababa continued to tighten its relations with other external powers such as Russia, the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, China, Iran. At the EU level, there was also a lack of coordination between the European institutions and the EU and its member states. And in fact, the initial reactions of the European Union was mostly the results of the EU Commission perceptions. As soon as the EU Council started to be engaged in the process, the European Union started to have a more balanced approach. In addition to this, intra-EU differences reduced the consistency and consequently also the impact of the EU policies. For instance, while the EU suspended its aid to Addis Ababa, its member states, such as Germany, continued to financially support Addis Ababa bilaterally. The EU should invest in foreign intelligence assets, first of all. The Tigray war has shown how information is necessary to act consistently. And without its own intelligence, it might be difficult for the EU to act impartially and objectively. This is especially true in conflict-affected areas where people's judgment might be influenced by emotion and in contexts characterized by internal fragmentation. The European Union foreign and security policy should also be supported by better coordination with member states, including their implementing agencies and public development banks, as well as the European Investment Bank and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. If Ethiopia is considered a strategic partner for the European Union, it should also be at the center of the Council preparatory committees on a more regular basis, so as to allow for a greater synthesis of the different positions of the member states and a greater coordination with the European institutions.